The ring came off before the second course was cleared, and Alethea Vane set it beside the Duke's plate with a click that carried the length of the table. She did not yet know that the small sound would be the loudest thing said at Ashworth Park all autumn. Had she known, she would have made it just the same. 26 years of being overlooked had taught her exactly how loud a quiet thing could be, if a woman chose her moment well. The Dowager Marchioness of Calder was still speaking when the ring came off, still smiling the smile that never quite reached the eyes, still turning the old Duchess's sapphire on her own finger as though it had always lived there. "We mustn't judge Miss Vane too harshly for the state of her gloves," Celestine was saying to the table at large, in a voice pitched low enough to sound like kindness and carrying enough to be heard by every guest from the épergne to the sideboard. "Her father, you know, left the family rather less than he ought. It is not her fault. Poverty is so rarely anyone's fault." A footman near the window did not move. A guest near the head of the table set down her fork with unnecessary care. And Julian Thorne, 9th Duke of Ashworth, said nothing at all. He sat with his wine untouched at his elbow and his eyes half-lidded and far away, the candlelight sliding off a face that gave back no more than a shuttered window gives back of the room behind it, and he let the silence stand where a word from him would have ended it. Alethea watched him not defend her. She had spent a lifetime reading faces the way her father had read a column of figures, for the small deviation that told the larger truth, and what she read in the Duke's face just then was not cruelty. It was absence. But absence, offered up in a room full of witnesses, costs exactly what cruelty costs, and she was not inclined, that particular evening, to parse the difference. She rose. She drew the betrothal ring from her finger, the plain gold band that had been his mother's before it was anyone's, and she laid it beside his plate with that one clean sound, and she said, "To no one, and to everyone, I find I have misplaced my appetite," and she walked out of the dining room of Ashworth Park with her back straight and her hands steady, though it would take her the length of the West Corridor before she trusted them not to shake. She had 19 days left before the Duke's 30th birthday, the day his father's will demanded he stand married or forfeit the guardianship of his sister and the running of his own house to the very woman smiling at the foot of the table, and she had just given back the only thing standing between that day and disaster. She did not think of the deadline as she walked. She thought only that she had done, at last, a thing her father would have called honest, and that honesty, this once, felt exactly like grief. She had come to Ashworth Park 7 weeks before, in a hired gig with one trunk and a letter of introduction from Mr. Aldous Fenn, the family's solicitor, who had known her father and had never, in all the years since his disgrace, quite believed the charge against him. The arrangement had been stated to her plainly, across a desk, by a duke she had met perhaps twice. "My father's will requires a wife by my 30th birthday, Miss Vane, or my sister's guardianship passes from me," Julian had said, turning a pen over and over in fingers that were, she had noted even then, roughened at the knuckle in a way no duke's hands had any business being. "I do not ask you to love the arrangement. I do not even ask you to love me. I ask only that you consider it, and that if you accept, you understand I do not spend people. I settle with them." It was, she had thought at the time, the coldest proposal she had ever heard, and also, somehow, the first honest one. She had grown up watching her father keep the accounts of a great house with a rigor that had eventually ruined him, and she recognized the temperament at once, a man who would rather be exact than kind, because he had been taught that exactness was the only kindness that held its shape under pressure. She had said yes not for love, which she had not expected, and not entirely for the small settlement that would keep her mother in coal through the winter. but because something in the flat arithmetic of the offer had felt, strangely, like being seen. Now, in the corridor outside the dining room, with the ring gone from her hand and her composure fraying at last where no one could see it, that memory felt like a debt he had defaulted on. She heard his step behind her before she heard her name. Alethea, just that. She did not turn. You did not have to let her say it, she said to the dark window instead of to him. I did not let her do anything. His voice was low and careful, the way a man's voice goes careful when he is choosing each word to keep from stumbling over the ones beneath it. I was not entirely present for it, I noticed. A silence. Somewhere below them, a door closed, and a burst of subdued laughter rose and fell in the dining room, the sound of guests deciding, collectively, to pretend nothing had happened. Come to the library, Julian said. Not to be forgiven. To be told the truth, as much of it as I am able to give you tonight. As much as you are able. She turned then, and found him leaning one shoulder against the corridor wall, as though the wall alone were keeping him upright, his eyes not quite focused, a fine sheen at his temple that had nothing to do with the heat of the room. You are not well, she said, and it was not a question. I am rarely well after supper, he said, and something in the flatness of it, the practiced flatness of a man reciting an old excuse, told her it was a lie he had told so often he had nearly convinced himself. It was Nathaniel Crewe, the butler who had served 3 dukes and buried 2 of them, who found her 20 minutes later in the small unused parlor off the servants' stair, sitting very upright in a very cold room, refusing to cry. He set down a lamp and a cup of something that smelled of chamomile, and did not ask permission to sit. You'll forgive an old man his opinions, he said, though I notice you've not yet given me leave to have any. You'll give them regardless. I generally do. He folded his hands over the head of his stick. Her ladyship has been mistress of this house's grief for 6 years, Miss Vane, ever since we buried Lord Calder, and grief, properly managed, is a very useful instrument. It excuses a great deal. It has excused, in my long observation, a very great deal indeed. You think she means him harm. I think, Crewe said, that a woman who wears her dead husband's mother's ring to another woman's betrothal dinner has already told you what she means, if you're willing to hear it plainly. I only ask that you not decide his grace is her accomplice before you've asked yourself why a man who has never in 9 years failed to rise, when a lady leaves a room, did not rise tonight. Alethea looked down at her bare hand, at the pale band where the ring had sat for 7 weeks, and felt the first cold thread of a different fear altogether, one that had nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with the columns and totals she had been raised to read. You think someone is doctoring his wine. I think, said Crewe, with the maddening evenness of a man who had learned long ago that the safest opinions were the ones offered as questions, that his physician prescribes 1 measure of the evening draught for the old wound in his shoulder, and that the apothecary's boy has twice this month delivered a parcel heavier than 1 measure ought to weigh. He rose, joints protesting, and paused at the door. A ledger balances, Miss Vane, or it lies. I understand your father taught you that particular arithmetic better than anyone living. I should think it applies to more than columns of figures. He left her with the maxim and the lamp and 19 days, and for the first time since the ring had left her hand, Alethea Vane found she was not thinking of leaving Ashworth Park at all. She was thinking of weight and dosage, and the particular gentleness of a woman who had never once, in 7 weeks, raised her voice. She did not sleep well that night, and near 2 a.m, restless, she went down to fetch a book from the library and found the door to the estate office standing a hand's width open, lamplight spilling gold across the corridor floor. She should have gone on. She had been raised, mostly to go on, to be the sort of woman whose feet made no sound and whose eyes saw nothing worth remarking. But her father's daughter could no more pass an open ledger book than a fish could pass dry land, and she stopped, and she heard, through the gap, Celestine's voice pitched low and businesslike, entirely unlike the syrup she wore at dinner. 2 more months, Silas. That is all I am asking of you. The girl reads figures the way other women read novels, and if she so much as glances at the Michaelmas rents before the wedding, we are both of us ruined. A man's voice, thinner, unhappier, answered from somewhere near the desk. You said the same at Lady Day, my lady, and at Christmas before that. There is a limit to what a bottle can hide, and I have my own name to think of. Your name, Celestine said, and there was iron under the syrup now, is worth exactly what my silence makes it worth, and you would do well to remember it. Keep him drowsy and keep him sweet, and by Michaelmas none of it will signify, because the estate will be in the courts, and the courts move slower than any bookkeeper's daughter. Alethea did not breathe. She stood in the dark, with her hand flat against the cold plaster, memorizing the shape of a name, Silas, and the word rents, and the word Michaelmas, and the particular music of a threat delivered without ever once raising its voice, and she understood, with the clean, falling certainty of a woman completing a sum, that the ring she had returned that evening had been meant to send her away. Before she ever thought to listen at a door, she went back up the stairs without the book. She did not yet have proof. But she had, for the first time since she had watched the Duke fail to rise, something better than heartbreak to occupy the 19 days that remained. She had a deadline of her own now, running parallel and silent beneath his, and she intended to reach the end of it first. She did not tell him what she had heard, not yet, and the not telling sat in her like a stone she carried, and did not set down. Because the moment she chose to speak it, everything that had passed between them so far, the negotiations, the small courtesies, the one evening he had laughed, actually laughed, over her account of a ruinous game of chess with the vicar's wife, would be measured against it and found either true or false. She wanted, before she spoke, to be sure which. The days that followed took on the shape of a truce neither of them named. He did not ask her to put the ring back on, and she did not ask him to explain the dinner, and instead they met, by a kind of unspoken arithmetic, over the one thing they could both be trusted to handle without breaking, the estate's books. It had been her idea, offered stiffly, over breakfast, 3 days after the ring came off. Your steward is behind on the quarter's accounts, she had said, not looking up from her toast. I kept my father's books from the age of 12. If it would be of use, and if you can bear a poor relation's daughter handling your figures, I am at your disposal. He had looked at her a long moment, the look of a man recalculating something. My father's steward, he said slowly, was dismissed for cooking his books 9 years ago. I did not think to ask his name until this moment. I am ashamed to say I never have. Josiah Vane, she said, and watched something move behind his eyes, quick and startled, gone before she could name it. You are his daughter. I am. Then you will forgive me, Julian said, for not knowing until now that the woman I asked to marry me is the daughter of a man my own family ruined. It was the first time either of them had said the word ruined aloud, and it sat between them on the breakfast table like a third guest, uninvited and impossible to ignore, and neither of them, that morning, was ready to ask it to explain itself. They worked in the estate office most afternoons after that, the two of them in a pot of ink and columns of figures that stretched back further than either of them had first intended to look, and it was, Alethea thought more than once, the strangest courtship a woman had ever conducted, carried out almost entirely in the language of debits and rents, and the small, telltale inconsistencies that a careful eye could find in another hand's careful forgery. Julian's hands, she noticed, were not a gentleman's hands. There was a callus at the base of his thumb that spoke of tool work, and when she asked him about it, on the fourth afternoon, he did not deflect the way she had expected a duke to deflect. "I keep a forge in the old dairy," he said, not looking up from the rent roll. "My brother died 4 years ago." A wall gave way beneath him at the quarry on the north boundary, a wall my father had been told twice needed shoring and twice declined to pay for. I could not go back and shore the wall. I could shoe a horse instead and mend a gate hinge, and it kept my hands busy enough that my head did not have room to finish the sentence it wanted to finish, which was that I might have stopped it had I only gone to look myself instead of trusting the report of a man who had every reason to lie to me about the state of the boundary wall. He said it the way a man reads out a debt he has long since accepted he will never finish paying, and Alethea, who had spent her whole life watching faces for the crack beneath the composure, saw the crack, and did not press it, and only said, after a moment, "That is not nothing you might have stopped. That is a wall someone else let fail." "I know that," he said. "I have known it 4 years. Knowing a thing and believing it are not the same arithmetic." It was the closest he had come, in 7 weeks, to laughing, a short exhale that was not quite a laugh, but stood adjacent to one, and Alethea marked it the way she marked every deviation in a column, quietly, and set it aside to be added to the sum later. That evening, going over the north boundary accounts, she found the first crack in the ledger itself. A repair entered and paid for, in Celestine's own hand, 6 years past, for a wall that Julian had just told her, not 3 hours before, had never once been shored. The soft threat came directly, 3 days later, in the rose garden, where Celestine found her cutting flowers for the dinner table, with the particular gentleness of a woman who had never in her life needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. "You've made yourself very useful in the office," Celestine said, snipping a bloom of her own, unhurried. "It is a pleasant change, I'm sure, from whatever situation your father's disgrace left you in." "It is," Alethea said, "though I find figures agree with me rather better than gossip does." "How fortunate." Celestine's shears paused over a stem. "I only wonder whether it is wise, a woman of your history poking about in another family's accounts." "People will say things. People already say things. I should hate for old wounds to be reopened on your account when a little discretion would spare everyone." "Discretion has never once been mistaken for honesty in my experience, my lady, whatever else it resembles." "No," Celestine agreed, smiling the smile that did not reach her eyes, and set the rose in her basket with a care that looked, for one unguarded instant, almost like grief. "It rarely is. We must all be reasonable, though, mustn't we, in the end?" She left with her basket and her roses, and Alethea stood a long moment in the cooling garden, turning the sentence over, "We must all be reasonable," the way she turned every figure that did not sum, and thought, that is not an opinion. That is a warning wearing an opinion's clothes. She went in and wrote the date in the small book she had begun keeping in her own hand, beside the word Silas and the word rents, and beneath it she wrote, "We must all be reasonable," and underlined it twice, because she had learned from her father that the most dangerous sentences in any house were always the gentlest ones. The blow, when it came dressed as mercy, which was, Alethea would later think, exactly what she ought to have expected from a woman who never raised her voice. It was Celestine herself who brought her into the small drawing room a fortnight before Michaelmas, her face arranged into an expression of pained reluctance that Alethea, by then, had learned to read as pure performance. "I did not want to be the one to show you this," Celestine said, and produced from her sewing basket a single folded letter, the paper soft with handling. "But I could not, in conscience, let you go on believing yourself the only claim on his affections." The letter was in a hand very like Julian's, close enough that a careless eye would never question it. Addressed to Celestine and dated some weeks past, and it spoke, in language warm enough to scald, of an arrangement that would not truly touch what lay between them, of a marriage undertaken for the estate's sake and nothing more, of a devotion that predated any bookkeeper's daughter and would outlast her. Alethea read it twice. Her hands did not shake, though she noted, distantly, that they wanted to. "This is not his hand," she said finally. "I have watched him write a column of rents every afternoon for a fortnight. The T's lean the wrong way." Celestine's face did something complicated, surprise and recalculation moving under the practiced grief so quickly that a less careful observer would have missed it entirely. "You would know his hand better than his own family, I suppose," she said, recovering, having spent so very much time alone with him in the office. "Though I wonder what the neighborhood would make of that particular intimacy, unchaperoned, day after day, if it came to be widely known." And there it was, not the forged letter at all, which Alethea now understood had been a clumsy first strike, easily parried, but the true weapon beneath it, the very thing that had made her useful to Julian, turned suddenly, deftly, into a scandal that could be laid at her own door. Her competence, her hours in the office, her unchaperoned afternoons of figures and forgeries, all of it could be repainted, with a few soft words in a few interested ears, as exactly the kind of impropriety that ruined a woman with no fortune and no family standing to protect her. She had thought her only danger was losing him. She saw now that she stood to lose considerably more than that, and that the woman across from her, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief that smelled of jasmine, worn 1 degree too sweet, had understood the shape of that danger long before Alethea had thought to fear it herself. She did not sleep at all that night, turning the forged letter over in her mind alongside the true entries she had found in the ledger, the wall never shored, the parcel from the apothecary heavier than it ought to be, and by morning she had reached a conclusion that frightened her more than the scandal itself. She was close enough to the truth that Celestine had felt the need to strike first, which meant the truth was closer to the surface than either of them had accounted for. She went to Julian directly, that same morning, before her nerve could cool, and laid the forged letter on his desk without preamble. "This is not your hand," she said, "but someone has taken great pains to make it resemble it, and your cousin by marriage showed it to me yesterday as proof of an affair I do not believe exists, and offered me, in the same conversation, a very clear notion of what would happen to my reputation should I continue to keep your books." He read it in silence, his jaw working, and when he looked up his eyes were clearer than she had seen them in weeks, clear in a way that told her, more than any confession could, exactly how much of the fog she had been navigating around him was not his own nature at all. "I have suspected her these 4 months," he said quietly, "since I began finding sums that would not close. I did not tell you because I feared. If she knew herself suspected, she would destroy what remained of the proof before I could gather it, and because Ophelia's guardianship rests on my marrying before Michaelmas, and I could not risk losing that fight while also fighting this one in the open. I chose to move slowly and alone. I see now that the slowness cost you something I had no right to let it cost." "It cost me the ring," Alethea said, "and very nearly cost me my name besides. I would rather be told the truth and frightened by it than protected from it and blindsided." He was silent a long moment, turning that over the way he turned every hard sum, unwilling to round it in his own favor. "Then I am telling you now," he said. "All of it, tonight." But that evening, before he could finish the sentence he had begun over the study fire, wheels sounded on the gravel below, urgent and too fast for a social call, and a messenger's fist struck the front door hard enough to carry up the stairs, and whatever confession Julian Thorne had been building died half-formed on his tongue as they both went down together to learn what news could not wait for morning. The messenger was Mr. Fenn's own clerk, wind-chapped and apologetic, bearing a letter that Fenn had sent express the moment he had finished reading it himself, a report from the county archive, procured at Fenn's own long-standing suspicion that Josiah Vane's disgrace had never sat right with the facts. Confirming that the original complaint against the old steward 9 years past had been laid not by the elder Duke's own hand, as the family had always believed, but countersigned and very likely authored by a young bride newly married into the family, whose signature the archive clerk had, by pure chance of alphabetical filing, laid beside a more recent document and found identical. It was not proof enough to hang a case on. It was proof enough to make a case worth building. Alethea read it, standing in the front hall in her dressing gown, her father's name in a stranger's careful clerk's hand at the bottom of a page that had waited 9 years to be read correctly, and felt something in her chest that she did not have a word for, grief and vindication arriving in the same breath and refusing to be separated. "She ruined him," she said, "before she ever ruined you. He was the rehearsal." Julian's face, reading over her shoulder, had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow without letting it show on the outside. "Then Michaelmas is no longer the only date that matters," he said. "We have 11 days. If she learns we have this before we are ready to use it, she will do exactly what I feared and burn what remains. Or worse. She will move against Ophelia directly, since the guardianship is the one prize that does not depend on paper at all." "Then we do not wait for Michaelmas to catch her," Alethea said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt, steady the way her father's voice had gone steady over a column that would not balance, the calm of a person who has found, at last, the exact place where the error lives. "We build the case, quietly, and we choose our own ground to spring it on, before she chooses hers." He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplit hall, at her bare hand where the ring had been, at the letter shaking very slightly despite her steady voice, and he asked her the one question that would decide everything that came after. "Will you stand beside me in it? Not for the estate, not for Ophelia, though God knows I want that too. I am asking whether you will stand in a room with that woman and call her what she is, knowing what it may cost you if we are wrong." Alethea thought of her father, dead 3 years now of a shame that had never been his, and of the ring lying cold on a dining table, and of a house full of witnesses who had watched her walk out and said nothing. "I have spent my whole life being the sort of person no one thought to defend," she said. "I find I have grown very tired of it. Yes, I will stand." They built the case the way her father had taught her to build any true account, from the bottom, entry by entry, refusing to trust a single figure that could not be checked against another. Crewe proved, in the end, the most valuable ally either of them had, for it was Crewe who remembered that old Josiah Vane, distrustful of a house he had already begun to suspect, had kept a private day book of his own in the last months before his dismissal, a small brown volume with brass corners that he had hidden, Crewe believed, in the steward's cottage at the edge of the home wood, which had stood empty and locked since the day Vane left it. Alethea and Crewe went out at first light before the house was stirring and found the cottage exactly as memory had left it. Dust thick and cold, and behind a loose stone in the hearth, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, the daybook itself. Her father had written his true figures in the ordinary way, in ink, in the ordinary columns, but beneath certain entries, in a fine pencil hand almost too faint to read, except by candlelight held close and angled, he had recorded the second set of numbers, the true rents actually collected against the false sums that had gone into the official ledger, and a name, written small and without embellishment, at the bottom of the final page, as though he had known even then that someone, someday, might need it spelled out plainly. C. Thorne, wife to Lord Calder, ledger discrepancies commencing Lady Day. Alethea held the page to the cottage window's gray morning light and read her father's careful, ruined hand, and did not weep, because weeping would have to wait. Because there was still Silas Reed's dispensing book to find, still the forged letter's true author to prove, still 11 days narrowing toward Michaelmas, and a woman in the great house above them who had already shown exactly how far. She would go to keep her arithmetic from ever balancing in the light. "We have him," Crewe said quietly, meaning the daybook, meaning the proof, and Alethea, wrapping the little volume back in its oilcloth with hands that had finally, blessedly stopped shaking, said only, "We have the beginning of him. Now we need the apothecary." Mr. Fenn came from the county town himself 2 days later, summoned by a letter that named no names and asked only that he attend Ashworth Park before Michaelmas on a matter of some delicacy. And it was Fenn, patient and thorough and long suspicious of a case he had never been able to close, who suggested the ground on which to spring it, not a private confrontation. Easily denied and later disputed, but the formal audit already scheduled for the day before the wedding, when Fenn himself, as executor of the late Duke's will, was required by that same will to review the estate's accounts before witnessing the marriage that would settle Ophelia's guardianship once and for all. It was, Alethea thought, a kind of justice her father would have appreciated, that the very document which had once been twisted to ruin an honest man would now be the instrument that unmade the woman who had twisted it. Silas Reed proved easier to move than either of them expected, once Julian went to him directly, not with threats, but with the flat, unhurried certainty of a man who already held enough to ruin him and was offering, instead, one chance to be the lesser villain in his own story. The apothecary's composure did not break all at once. It cracked first at the mention of his dispensing book, the one Julian's own physician kept a duplicate ledger against, and it broke entirely when Julian asked him a single question. Quietly, without any heat in it at all, "Did she ever tell you what would happen to my sister Mr. Reed if I did not marry in time? Did she tell you whose guardian she meant to become?" Reed had gone gray and sat down without being asked, and by the time he rose again he had agreed to say, before witnesses, exactly what he had been paid, and by whom, and for how long, and Alethea, watching from the doorway, saw the first true crack open in a scheme that had held for 9 long years, not from any blow struck against Celestine directly, but from the simple, patient work of laying one honest fact beside another until the false ones had nowhere left to stand. The audit was set for 11 o'clock on the morning before the wedding, in the long library at Ashworth Park, and Celestine came into the room in pale gray silk, with her dead husband's mother's sapphire on her finger, and no notion, Alethea was almost certain, that anything waited for her beyond the ordinary tedium of Fenn's yearly review. Ophelia sat near the window with her governess, too young to be told the whole of it, but old enough to be present, because Julian had insisted, quietly, that his sister see with her own eyes exactly why her guardianship would remain where it belonged. Crewe stood by the door as though merely attending, and Silas Reed sat near the hearth with his own dispensing book closed on his knee and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, a man waiting to be called. Fenn opened the estate's official ledgers first, in the ordinary way, reading rents and expenditures aloud in his dry clerk's voice, and Celestine answered his questions with the easy, practiced patience of a woman who had done this every year for 6 years and never once feared the outcome. It was Alethea who set her father's daybook on the table between them, the small brown volume with the brass corners, and opened it to the penciled column beneath the inked one, and held the page toward the window's clean daylight so that the fainter hand showed itself plainly against the true. "These are the rents actually collected the quarter my father was dismissed," she said, her voice steady in a room that had gone suddenly, entirely silent, "and these, beside them, are the rents entered in the official book that same quarter, in your hand, my lady, which I have had occasion to study very closely these past weeks over the estate's current accounts. I find the two hands agree rather better than the two sums do." Celestine did not move. "A penciled scribble in a dead man's book proves nothing," she said, evenly, and the evenness itself, Alethea thought, was its own small confession, for an innocent woman would have been outraged, and Celestine only sounded careful. "It proves a discrepancy 9 years old," Fenn agreed, mild as ever, "which I confess I have wondered about for 9 years myself. Discrepancies alone are not proof of a hand, my lady. You are quite right. Proof of a hand is a different matter, and happens to be sitting rather closer to us than the discrepancy." He drew out, unhurried, the forged letter Celestine had shown Alethea in the drawing room, and set it beside a page of undisputed household correspondence in Celestine's own script. The loops and slants laid side by side in plain daylight, close enough to convince a careless glance, and nowhere near close enough to survive a careful one. "Miss Vane noticed the lean of the letters some weeks ago," Julian said, his voice very quiet, very level. "I confess I did not believe her at first. I have since had occasion to compare a dozen of your own letters against it, Celestine, and I no longer doubt her at all." It was the mention of the wine that finally broke the surface entirely, and it broke not because of anything Julian or Alethea said, but because Fenn turned, with the same mild patience he had shown all morning, to the apothecary by the hearth. "Mr. Reed," he said, "you keep, I understand, a duplicate dispensing record, as the law requires of all licensed apothecaries in the county. Would you tell the room what dose of laudanum His Grace's physician prescribed for the evening draught, and what dose you were in fact instructed to deliver, and by whom?" Silas Reed's hands were shaking on the closed cover of his own ledger. He looked, for a long moment, not at Fenn and not at Julian, but at Celestine, and something passed between them that was not quite an apology and not quite a plea, and then he opened the book. "One measure prescribed," he said, his voice cracking on the second word and steadying only by force of will. "I was paid, quarterly, to deliver 3, and to say nothing to the physician, who never thought to ask, since His Grace's shoulder does trouble him genuinely, and a heavier dose was easy enough to explain by the wound alone. I did it for money I am ashamed of, and I have not slept easy a night since the day I agreed to it." He looked up, finally, and met Celestine's eyes squarely for the first time since he had entered the room. "I am sorry, my lady. I am more sorry than I have words to carry. But I will not go to my own ruin quietly to save you from yours." The silence that followed had a different quality than any that had come before it in that long room, and into it, at last, Celestine's composure gave way, not with a shout, not with tears exactly, but with a kind of collapse of posture, the sapphire ring catching the light as her hand rose unconsciously to her throat, and when she spoke her voice had none of the syrup left in it at all. "He never gave me anything," she said, low, almost to herself. "Rafe, my husband." 4 years married, and he left me a jointure that would not have kept this house's silver polished, because his father thought a marchioness ought to be grateful for the title and require nothing further. And when Rafe died, I understood, all at once, that I would spend the rest of my life a poor relation in a house that had never once considered what I might need to live. I did not begin because I wanted riches. I began because I was afraid, and then I could not stop, because stopping meant confessing how far I had already gone, and every year the confession grew larger than the year before, until confessing it became unthinkable, and continuing it became the only arithmetic I knew how to do. She looked, in that moment, very small in her pale gray silk, an old grief showing plainly beneath the years of practiced gentleness, and Alethea, watching her, felt the anger she had carried since the dinner table soften, unwillingly, into something closer to pity. The particular pity that comes from recognizing, in an enemy's ruin, the shape of a fear one has felt oneself. Julian let the silence hold a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried none of the triumph the room might have expected of a man who had just won back his house, his sister, and his name in a single morning. "I will not have you tried, Celestine," he said, "not for my sake, and not entirely for yours, but because a trial would drag Ophelia's name through every scandal sheet in the county, and I will not spend my sister's peace to purchase your punishment. You will sign the accounts as Mr. Fenn directs, restoring what can be restored, and you will remove to the dower cottage at Calder Reach on an allowance sufficient to live quietly, and not 1 shilling more. And you will not set foot in this house again while my sister is a child in it. That is not mercy earned. I want you to understand that plainly. It is mercy given. Because I find I would rather be the kind of man who gives it than the kind who withholds it to feel powerful, and because Josiah Vane's daughter taught me, this past month, that a house is only as honest as the people who choose, when they have every right to be cruel, to be exact instead. Celestine did not thank him. She only nodded once, the sapphire still turning on her finger, and said, in a voice gone thin with something that might have been relief, "We must all be reasonable. In the end, mustn't we?" And Alethea, hearing her own private warning handed back, transfigured into a surrender, understood that the phrase had never truly been a threat at all, only the sound a frightened woman made when she wanted the world to mistake her fear for composure. Silas Reed, for his cooperation and his conscience, was permitted to keep his license on condition he answer to the county board directly, a mercy Fenn argued for on the plain grounds that a man who confesses unprompted against his own interest has already begun the work of becoming honest again. And Josiah Vane's name, there in that same library, before those same witnesses, was formally struck from the estate's record of dismissal and entered instead as wrongfully accused, the clerk's pen scratching out 9 years of injustice in the time it took to dip and write, while his daughter stood very still and did not, this time, try to keep from crying. It was nearly evening before the library emptied, Fenn gone to draw up the settlement papers, Celestine gone upstairs under Crewe's carefully unobtrusive escort to begin packing what was hers, and Julian and Alethea left alone at last among the ledgers and the last low light through the tall windows. And it was Julian who crossed the room first and knelt, without ceremony, to retrieve something from the floor beside the hearth where it had fallen unnoticed from his coat during the long morning. He held out the plain gold ring that had been his mother's, the one she had set beside his plate a fortnight ago, and he did not offer it the way he had the first time, across a desk, in the language of settlements and arrangements. "I asked you once to marry me because a will demanded it," he said. "I am not asking you that now. Ophelia's guardianship is settled without needing a wife by Michaelmas at all, since the will's true intent, Fen tells me, was only ever that I marry honestly, and a formal audit clearing my name and hers satisfies the spirit of it well enough that no court in the kingdom would contest it. I do not need to marry anyone, Alethea. I am asking you to marry me, because in 7 weeks you have read me more truly than anyone alive save perhaps Crew, and because I find I do not want to go back to a house where no one reads me at all. I told you once I do not spend people. I settle with them. I find I was wrong. I do not wish to settle with you. I wish, if you will permit it, simply to ask. Alethea looked at the ring, and at the man holding it, hands still marked with the forge, eyes clear for the first time since she had known him, and thought of her father's own maxim, the one she had carried through every dark week of the ledgers and the lies. A ledger balances, she said slowly, or it lies. My father taught me that before I could properly write my own name, and I have measured nearly everything against it since, including, I think, you, but love is not a ledger, is it? It does not need to balance to be true. It only needs to be honest. She held out her bare hand. Ask me then, properly, not settled. Asked, and he did, there in the fading light among the columns of figures that had, between them, unmade a 9-year lie, and she said yes in a voice that did not need to carry the length of any table to be heard, because this time there was no one left in the room to convince but each other. They were married a fortnight later, quietly, in the small stone church at Fenbrook, rather than the grand one in the county town Celestine would once have chosen, with Ophelia as the sole bridesmaid, solemn with the importance of her ribbon and her basket of late roses, and Crew standing at the back of the church in his best coat, weeping without the slightest attempt to disguise it, informing anyone near him afterward that he had buried 2 dukes and would be switched before he apologized for crying at the making of a 3rd. Mrs. Vane came from her sister's cramped rooms in the county town to see her daughter married, thinner than Alethea liked and leaning hard on her cane, but present, and settled before the month was out into the old steward's cottage at the edge of the home wood, mended and whitewashed, and fitted with a new hearth, where she grew roses over the very stone that had once hidden her husband's day. Book, which now sat, mounted under glass, in the estate library, where Fen had insisted it belonged, as a standing record that a house's true accounts, however long buried, do not stay buried forever. Silas Reed answered to the county board and kept his shop, chastened, and was known thereafter to weigh every dose twice before he dispensed it, and to speak of it when asked. As the year he learned that a man's conscience is also a kind of ledger, and equally capable of being called to account. Miss Honora Vale, who had watched the whole scandal unfold with the avid, superior interest of a woman who had once hoped to be Duchess herself, called on Alethea within the week to offer, stiffly at first, and then with real warmth, both her apology for the gossip she had carried and her friendship going forward, an offer Alethea accepted with the plain, undramatic grace of a woman who had learned, this past season, exactly how much a genuine apology was worth. And Celestine, from the dower cottage at Calder Reach, wrote once a year, on Ophelia's birthday, a brief, correct letter that Julian read and answered and never once mentioned again, the closest thing to peace either of them could honestly claim, which was, Alethea thought, its own kind of mercy, quietly kept. It was nearly a year later, almost to the week, that Alethea stood again at the head of the Ashworth dinner table, the same candles guttering gold against the tall windows, and watched a thrush settle on the sill outside and sing, unbothered, into a room grown warm with ordinary happiness. Ophelia sat at her right hand now, no longer solemn but laughing at some comment of Crew's, delivered with the particular deadpan he reserved for the family he had come to consider entirely his own. Julian sat at the foot of the table, with his sleeves turned back from an afternoon at the forge, his wine untouched beside him, not from any drowsiness, but because he had simply, as was his habit now, forgotten it in the pleasure of the conversation. And when his eyes met Alethia's down the length of the table, there was nothing shuttered in them at all, nothing absent, only the plain, steady attention of a man fully present in his own house for the first time in longer than either of them cared to count. She touched the ring on her finger, the same plain gold band, worn now to the shape of her hand, and thought of another dinner, a year gone, when she had set that ring down beside a plate and walked out into a corridor, believing she had lost everything worth keeping. She had not known, that night, what the small sound of gold against china would come to cost her, or what it would come to give her instead. She knew now. A ledger balances, her father used to say, or it lies, and she had spent a lifetime believing that was the whole of the lesson, until a grave, quiet man with a forge-scarred hand had taught her the rest of it, that love was not an account to be balanced at all, only a truth to be kept, plainly, in the light, before whatever witnesses cared to see it. If this story warmed you, the way a returned ring can mean an ending, or, if a woman is patient and exact and brave enough, only the start of a truer beginning, then pull your chair a little closer to the fire, because I have a kettle on and a candle lit and no plans at all to send you back out into the cold tonight. I would love to know, in the comments below, which moment stayed with you longest, the click of that ring against the china, or the hush in the library when the penciled column finally spoke. And if you found yourself, even once, holding your breath for Alethea Vane, stay a while longer and subscribe, so there's always a place kept for you by this hearth when the next story is ready to be told. Until then, be patient with your own hard sums, be honest in your own quiet ledgers, and be gentle, always, with the ones who kept your lamp lit when you could not yet see the way home.